Hi everyone, my name is Alicia and I am organizing for Extinction Rebellion Canada, more specifically here in Ontario. We have created an Ontario version of this onboarding talk called Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. If you would like to give this talk in your community, there are links in the description below that will help you do that. This presentation here on YouTube is meant as a sample, or if you can't get out to one of our talks in person, you can go ahead and watch this and see what we're all about here. Okay, so let's get started. Heading for extinction and what to do about it. So here's just a short history of Extinction Rebellion, and it started up in 2018 in the UK. It was a campaign led by a grassroots organization called Rising Up, and it's quickly turned into a global movement with chapters in over 35 countries and growing. So a version of the talk you'll see now was given over a period of 6 months and helped to motivate more than 6,000 people to shut down 5 bridges in London. So this action was a nonviolent occupation to bring awareness to our global climate emergency. 85 people were arrested, and subsequent media exposure helped to launch Extinction Rebellion into a global movement. We will cover 2 main things in this presentation. Part 1 will be all about the ecological crisis. We will provide the latest science on what risks there are and our current trajectory, which includes the possibility of abrupt, near-term, and dramatic climate change, as well as human extinction. Part 2, we will talk about understanding our emotional response and about appropriate responses to the information that is presented here. This talk can take up to an hour, and there will be time for questions at the end and space to stay behind afterwards to discuss and share with one another when in person, when seeing this talk in person. And the basic premise of this talk is to tell the truth and ask us all to act accordingly and consistently with the information, including our understanding of what actually enables change to happen in the world. It's worth noting that grief is welcome here and welcome within the movement. What we're sharing is very hard to hear, so we thank you all for being willing to face this. While this isn't really a grief workshop, you are welcome, obviously, to shed tears and express emotion. When you see this talk in person, there is time and space at the end to discuss and share feelings with one another. It's very important. So before we head into some of these facts that we'll be presenting here, we really need to talk about the usefulness of sources. So the precautionary principle states that when there are extremely severe risks, we should not take those risks. We should err on the side of caution. However, science reporting is naturally quite conservative in order to be rigorous. A scientist down at the pub will say more about what they believe the risks are than they may say in a paper, while they only want to report what they definitely know in that paper. So a single paper can be wrong. Reviews of different papers about the same thing tends to lead to more accuracy. However, it takes much longer to get reviews of many papers. The IPCC has been built around consensus, and there are lengthy processes to reach consensus. Some feel that it's deliberate, but it's useful to quote from this spectrum, so not just what is seen as mainstream or fully acceptable. In this talk, we attempt to give you useful information by moving beyond just the IPCC reports. Useful, though much of their outputs are. We need to hear from the respected scientists who have broken ranks with conservative speech, especially since Panel 3 of the IPCC contains policymakers and economists and is seen as highly politicized. We also don't need to join the so-called alarmists who are accused of cherry-picking data and might talk about facts when they mean possibilities. That said, we're not suggesting the so-called alarmists are wrong, and alarming messages are definitely making it into the mainstream. So we're aiming to give you the latest thinking from those at the leading edge of climate and ecological science. So the precautionary principle, it's When an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. Something to keep in mind throughout this talk is that the precautionary principle is applied to most areas of public life as general health and safety guidelines. So even if we don't fully understand something, as long as the consequences could be terrible, it should be avoided by all means. This is just a short excerpt from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and it says, the precautionary principle denotes a duty to prevent harm when it is within our power to do so, even when all the evidence is not in. This principle has been codified in several international treaties to which Canada is a signatory. Domestic law makes reference to this principle, but implementation remains limited. So let's move on to part one, the presentation here, where we'll talk about the climate catastrophe and the ecological crisis and why we must tell the truth. And what we will see again and again during this talk is that experts are becoming increasingly pessimistic about the state of play. The debate around climate change is heavily dominated by the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. However, David Spratt, who is a research director for Breakthrough Institute in Australia and co-author of a book called What Lies Beneath: The Understatement of Existential Climate Risk, he lists some reasons questioning some of the IPCC's conclusions, or at least giving us reasons why we should move beyond them. And some of them are because there is a systematic tendency to understatement, that the physical changes are so rapid, and that this is such a new discipline, studying the effects of climate change. And oftentimes, by the time the scientists figure out what is going on, and it could be 3 to 4 years before their papers are even publicized. So this is a huge communication problem, and there are so many uncertainties. And some people feel that science is under attack because the IPCC summary allows for policymakers to vote on what comes out, basically. And so it becomes a paper set by diplomats and not scientists. And the IPCC has a history of too conservative estimates, period. So, as it's so often pointed out, the IPCC also relies heavily on negative emission technology. And that's negative emission technologies that are used to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Carbon capture and storage has been researched for decades and has proved to work, but not on the required scale, and it would be highly costly. Let's take the decline in sea ice for an example here. The graph highlights issues with some IPCC reports, or the work that they do. The actual data is far worse than the consensus predictions. The graph in blue shows IPCC models of what is believed will happen to the Arctic ice, and the line in red shows what is actually happening. So there's a big difference there. As you can see, climate science is often too cautiously described. So what is happening? We will touch upon locked-in temperature increases, tipping points, feedback loops, and impacts. Looking back at the actual data more closely on Arctic sea ice, we can see the data suggests the Arctic will be ice-free at the end of the summer, sometime in the next 5 years or so. This melting is creating what is called the albedo effect, which is an example of a worrying feedback loop of climate change. So when there's a lack of reflective ice, and this is replaced by dark ocean, which absorbs more heat, this process will have the same effect as releasing 1/4 of all the CO2 released since 1979. Climate change is not simply a matter of cause and effect. It's more like a vicious circle. Rising temperatures cause melting of ice in Greenland and Antarctica, and this is associated with sea level rise. This map shows the populations at risk of the resulting flooding. Many cities are based on rivers or on the coast. Some will be submerged forever. Others will sustain vast damage and destruction. Alongside other migratory pressures such as desertification, estimates suggest 140 million people could be on the move. Where will people go? How will countries cope with the possibility of 1 in 9 people on the move? In 2018, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America released a paper addressing the threat of so-called abrupt climate change. This happens when things happen very quickly and become essentially irreversible due to runaway effects. So 10 positive feedback loops were studied. Permafrost thaw, loss of methane hydrates from the ocean floor, weakening land and ocean carbon sinks, increasing bacterial respiration in the oceans, Amazon rainforest dieback, boreal forest dieback, reduction of northern hemisphere snow cover, loss of Arctic summer ice, and reduction of Antarctic sea ice and polar ice sheets. While it's not a certainty, the concern is that Earth is headed rapidly into a hothouse state, even if temperatures are kept below 2 degrees Celsius, which seems unlikely. 50 years ago, this would be dismissed as alarmist, but now scientists have become really worried. And we should be too. The data on this graph shows increases in global average temperature since 1850. Currently, we're around 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial baselines, and we're rising at 0.17 degrees Celsius per decade. However, these rises won't be linear. And it's important to note that these temperature increases are already locked in. They have been caused by past activity and are unavoidable. A 2017 Nature Climate Change paper from the University of Washington shows that we have only 1% chance of hitting the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that were set in Paris, in the Paris Agreement. We only have 5% chance temperatures will be less than 2 degrees Celsius, and the likely range is 2 to 4.9 degrees Celsius, with an average median of 3.2 degrees Celsius. So what does this mean? In the lifetime of children today, we're headed towards catastrophic temperature rises. This should be on the news every single night, with discussions and stories about what is being done, what's being tried to protect our children, as if we're involved in a world war. In actual fact, this is far, far worse than a world war. So what will happen? What will happen once we see these temperature rises? The Amazon will start to burn down. If we increase global temperatures by 3 degrees Celsius, the water in the Amazon will start to dry up and the rate of forest fires will increase. Forests will become net carbon producers and not the sinks they are today. Global food security will be severely impacted. Crops will fail on a more regular basis. Many areas will cease to produce food at all due to flooding or desertification. What happens to society when food prices spike? Or if they're just not available, if food isn't available? Then there are a raft of other pressures on the ecology. Known as the evil twin of climate change, ocean acidity has increased by about 30% and is set to increase by 150% by year 2100. 20% of people rely on marine life for nutrition, which is under multiple pressures and could collapse with the increasing acidity caused by the formation of carbonic acid when carbon dioxide dissolves in the oceans. Some marine creatures are unable to build their skeletons or shells in an acidic ocean. Oceans, like forests, are the lungs of the earth. They produce between 50 and 80% of the oxygen and consume more than 25% of carbon dioxide of the planet, but this is reliant on a thriving marine ecosystem. Then we have other ecological pressures such as water depletion, air, soil, and water pollution from particulates, plastic, and chemicals, deforestation, and habitat loss. Even the most optimistic predictions are dire. So, where are we in Canada? According to our Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, average temperatures in Canada have already increased by 1.7 degrees Celsius since 1948. Continued amplification of warming at high latitudes is projected under all scenarios of future climate change, she explains. Along with higher temperatures and increased rainfall, we will see rising sea levels. Warmer waters and ocean acidification are expected to become increasingly evident over the next century. The nation has experienced a higher rate of warming than most other regions of the world, particularly in its far north and west. This warming has been most pronounced in the winter and springtime and is leading to a number of major impacts across the country. These include permafrost and ice melt in the Arctic, sea level rise, and more frequent and severe extreme weather, such as once uncommon heat extremes and major changes in precipitation. When examined on a regional basis, average winter temperatures for 2016-2017 were among the 10 warmest on record since 1948 for 5 of the 11 climate regions. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence region was 4th warmest at 3.8 degrees Celsius above average. Mackenzie District was 5th warmest at 5 degrees Celsius above average. Arctic Tundra, also 5th warmest at 3.5 degrees above average. Northeastern Forest was 3 degrees Celsius above average. And the Northwestern Forest was 9th warmest at 3.5 degrees above average. None of the 11 climate regions experienced an average winter temperature for 2016-2017 since 1948. So all 11 climate regions exhibit positive trends for winter temperatures over the 70 years of record. The strongest trend is observed in North British Columbia Mountains, Yukon region, with a rise of 5.7 degrees Celsius, while the weakest trend, 0.6 degrees Celsius, is found in the Atlantic region of Canada. And we've already seen evidence of this, and we're seeing a massive yearly increase in wildfires in British Columbia. A total of 2,092 wildfires have burned 1,351,000 plus hectares of land as of November 9th, 2018. The fires forced many people to evacuate. Some folks died, homes were destroyed, and the full effect on wildlife is still unknown. The smoke could be seen from space and was reported to be felt as far away as Ireland. Last summer's fires were 10 times worse than in 2017, and with the ever-increasing change in temperature and precipitation, they are projected to become worse and worse every year going forward. So what can we expect here in Ontario? Well, climate change is already increasing the risk of wildfires, as we've seen last summer in northern Ontario. It's crippling cold water fish habitats, stressing moose populations, and helping invasive species flourish in Ontario, just like the ticks, right? Outdoor winter sports, our season is shortening. Severe heat and drought have damaged crops and affected water supplies. And we can also expect extreme heat causing dehydration and death, poor air quality, severe electrical and thunderstorms, high winds, possible tornadoes like we saw in Ottawa, flooding, power failures due to the drain on our energy systems, trying to stay cool, and dehydration. So in 2015, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were the highest they've been in at least 800,000 years. While Ontario lowered its carbon footprint to 6% below 1990 levels in 2014, this is mostly through the closing of coal-fired power generation stations. It still relies on fossil fuels for 80% of its energy. And the graph on the left here shows that transportation represents the largest and fastest growing share of emissions here in Ontario. And how does this affect our Ontario farmers? Although they are seeing a longer growing season across the province, issues such as temperature rise, change in precipitation patterns, flooding, and summer drought are becoming very real challenges to producing a successful yield. food insecurity is a huge factor for us. So here are just a couple of personal examples which have been reported that climate change is affecting regular folks here in Ontario right now. There's a new storm norm. Okay, Weather Channel meteorologist and storm hunters personality says swings in weather have been getting wilder over the last 15 years that he's been monitoring tornadoes and extreme storms. Time for new vines. Climate change is changing the type of wine that winemakers, they're changing the type of grapes that can be grown so that they do better in harsh climates. Three is using ice for infrastructure. And some of us know that one way to beat the traffic in Ottawa during the winter has been to strap on your skates and hit the frozen Rideau Canal. So this, it's not a sure bet anymore with changing temperature patterns. Locked up lakes, number four. Basically, any way you look at it, ship owners are reluctantly to put their vessels in the water due to high risk ice conditions, which can vary from year to year. Number five, beaches are closed for swimming due to blue-green algae. It's really nasty stuff, and it's bacteria that can create neurological problems and seizures amongst humans and dogs. And blooms are mostly caused by increased amounts of phosphates from agricultural runoff. The warmer water also allows this algae to grow into this toxic scum. And number six is getting ticked. We've all heard the increase of ticks and Lyme disease happening here in Ontario, and the possibilities for being invaded, they increase with the warming temperatures. Now, all of this doesn't really seem so bad in comparison to the global climate catastrophe, but be assured we are in grave danger. And this brings us to the issue of extinction. There have been 5 mass extinctions that scientists can see in the geological record. The last one involving the dinosaurs was caused by an asteroid strike. The other 4 were caused by rapid increases in atmospheric CO2. For example, it's caused by a huge volcanic eruption. The most devastating extinction event to date was the Permian Triassic extinction, in which 97% of all life was lost due to runaway feedback loop events that led to the gassing of the planet by hydrogen sulfide. The rate of CO2 emissions mirrors those today, so we know that human extinction is a possibility on our current trajectory. We have already entered the 6th mass species extinction. Scientists are using the phrase biological annihilation. The Holocene extinction, otherwise referred to as the 6th extinction, is the ongoing extinction event of species during the present Holocene epoch, mainly due to human activity. The large number of extinctions spans numerous families of plants and animals. The current rate of extinction of species is estimated at 100 to 1,000 times higher than natural background rates. Remember we said we were heading towards over 3 degrees of warming and possibly towards 5? Many scientists are sounding the alarm and stating this is a very serious existential threat to our species. Some humans are likely to survive, though it's far from guaranteed. But the question is then, under what conditions? Remember, we are talking about what happens in the lifetime of children on Earth today. Professor Jem Bandel has been in the environmental field for many, many years, and he's recently done a paper called Deep Adaptation, where he breaks ranks from academic conservatism. He's done his own review of all the scientific literature, and he has access to the very latest data. Now, last September, he gave a presentation which shows the possible mechanisms that will lead to collapse, and in his mind, this will happen in the next 3 years' time. So, societal collapse is inevitable and soon, via immense catastrophes that will very likely cause massive loss of human life, as well as other life extinction that's already happening with a possible human extinction. We should be getting up-to-date data on a nightly basis on the news. We should be making plans for adaptation and mitigation. One more thing before we move on.
Although on the surface, this fact does not seem to be related to climate change, it is one of the scariest climate change facts. All of these conditions, migrations, crop failure, and disasters, they're a perfect breeding ground for fascism, and the signs of it are already here. Powerful and continuing nationalism, disdain for human rights, identification of enemies as a unifying cause, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, controlled mass media, obsession with national security, religion and government intertwined, corporate power protection, labor power suppressed, disdain for intellectuals and the arts, obsession with crime and punishment, rampant cronyism and corruption, and fraudulent elections. Sound familiar? Rob Raymond, the founder and president of the Nexus Institute, says that although we are fond of saying never again, fascism hijacks democracy over and over, and that we are ignoring the signs because denial is more comfortable than facing inconvenient truths. Now, this story is pretty scary, I'm not going to lie. Professor of Media Theory and Digital Economics wrote a blog about, well, it's called The Wealthy Are Plotting to Leave Us Behind, and this is his story. Last year, I got invited to a super deluxe private resort to deliver a keynote speech that I assumed would be 100 or so investment bankers. It was by far the largest fee I had ever been offered for a talk, about half of my annual professor's salary, all to deliver some insight on the subject of the future of technology. My audience was brought to me. 5 super wealthy guys, yes, all men, from the upper echelon of the hedge fund world. After a bit of small talk, I realized they had no interest in the information I had prepared about the future of technology. They had come with questions of their own. Which region will be less impacted by the coming climate crisis, New Zealand or Alaska? Finally, the CEO of a brokerage house explained that he had nearly completed building his own underground bunker system and asked, "How do I maintain authority over my security force after the event?" They knew armed guards would be required to protect their compounds from the angry mobs, but how would they pay the guards once money was worthless? What would stop the guards from choosing their own leader? The billionaires considered using special combination locks on the food supply that only they knew, or making guards wear disciplinary collars of some kind in return for their survival, or maybe building robots to serve as guards and workers, if that technology could be developed in time. The event is the name that the elite are giving to the breakdown of society. They are anticipating it, but even they feel powerless to do anything about it, despite the fact that there are many detailed things written about changes that could and need to be made. So, how is our government responding to these threats to our nation? Well, in Canada, Justin Trudeau is buying more pipelines, expanding the tar sands, investing in new oil and gas infrastructure, continuing to subsidize animal agriculture, ignoring the United Nations declarations of rights of Indigenous people, and the list goes on. Here in Ontario, Doug Ford is canceling carbon tax. He's fired the Environment Commissioner. He's trying to remove endangered species protection, tried to destroy the green belt, and working on privatizing healthcare, and the list just goes on. It's all very disappointing and completely backwards from what we ought to be doing right now with this information. When Doug Ford announced he'd be canceling the cap and trade program in Ontario, our Environment Commissioner, Diane Sachs, issued this statement. The Cap and Trade Cancellation Act, the government's proposed replacement climate law, is much too weak. A meaningful climate law needs science-based emission budgets, a legal obligation to stay within those budgets, and credible, transparent progress reporting. So basically, this means that the government will take charge of investigating itself whenever things seem to go wrong in its efforts to protect environmental health and rights. Not long after that statement was made, Premier Doug Ford fired our Environment Commissioner, well, by removing the entire office of the Environment Commissioner, actually. Um, and this is what Diane Sachs had to say. I'm outraged and heartbroken. What a way to mark the 25th anniversary of the Environmental Bill of Rights, but to silence the commissioner and restrict the rights of the public. The government is saying to the people, you can trust us. They say they're going to police themselves. Now, when has that ever worked? And speaking of policing themselves, shortly after our premier was elected, he sent out a memo to the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, as well as Ontario Parks, asking them not to mention the term climate change on any government social media sites. He has since denied doing this, but the proof remains that these email directives were indeed sent from his office. How can anybody ever trust somebody who doesn't even want to mention the word climate change? Clearly, we're not looking at someone who is willing to tell the truth to the people. So, we must face reality about the lack of concrete action or even the lack of honesty here from our politicians. In 1990, the UN warned that climate change was happening and stated that if we did not keep global temperature increases below 1 degree Celsius, then there would be societal collapse across the world. Since then, carbon emissions have increased by 60%, and we are now at a closer to 1.2 degrees Celsius rise. We conclude that conventional approaches to dealing with climate change have failed to deal with the problem on two levels. One, governments failed to introduce the large-scale changes that are only in their power to implement. And number two, environmental organizations failed to put enough pressure on governments to introduce these changes. How does the international community manage to carry on with business as usual? I don't know. Dr. Kate Marvell is from NASA's Goddard Institute. She researches humanity's effect on climate and what we can expect in the future. And she says, to be a climate scientist is to be an active participant in a slow motion horror story. We are inevitably sending our children to live on an unfamiliar planet. As a climate scientist, I am often asked to talk about hope, particularly in the current political climate. Audiences want to be told that everything will be all right in the end. Climate change is bleak, the organizers always say. And tell us a happy story. Give us hope. The problem is, I don't have any. Hope is a creature of privilege. We know that things will be lost, but it is comforting to believe that others will bear the brunt of it. But the opposite of hope is not despair. It is grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn. And here, the sheer scale of the problem provides a perverse comfort. We are in this together. The swiftness of the change, its scale, and inevitability binds us into one broken heart trapped together under a warming atmosphere. We need courage, not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We are all fated to live lives shot through with sadness and are not worth less for it. Courage is a resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. And so again, we remind you that grief is welcome here. Let's all take a few minutes to let what we've heard so far really sink in. And if you are at a live presentation of this talk, we would take a break. At this point. You can pause the video if you'd like and let it all sink in before we move on. Moving along to part two of what to do about it, are emotional and practical responses. So how does this existential threat affect the way you wish to live your life? I am saying, as one grown up to another in a troubled time, you have an obligation to be able to proceed minus any assurance that anything good will come from it. And that's a quote from Stephen Jenkinson, who talks about our death-phobic culture. And my understanding is that our dying times are an opportunity to really live well if we pay attention to how precious life is. That we come to peace when we understand that life is far bigger than any of us as individuals.
We can understand our role as we join a line of worthy ancestors, those that went before us, and make our lives about honoring and protecting those that come after us. In the age of ecological meltdown, when our own children's future is currently set to an unimaginable catastrophe, it is our job to really allow ourselves to feel the grief and then ask how we intend to act. This is a big shift in our consciousness. It is one that moves away from the narcissistic culture of consumerism. What do I need? How can I feel better? How do I hang on to privilege for myself and my family? It moves towards accepting that this is a time of grief, but that we can still appreciate beauty. We can still keep ourselves in good shape for the task required of us. It asks us to step into service and be willing to do the things that might just make a difference. It asks us to make sacrifices. This is a big emotional shift. It's actually quite liberating. So as hope dies, we see the beginnings of action. We need a new approach in the face of this failure. We need the world governments to introduce a World War II style mobilization. For example, the American economy was transformed in a matter of a few months to deal with the existential threat for its population brought about by World War II. So a World War II style climate mobilization would involve reducing carbon emissions to zero within the next 5 years, 6 years, reducing demand through a carbon rationing program, massive investment in safe ways of taking carbon out of the atmosphere, rebuilding transport, so a complete overhaul of our transportation systems, high-speed electrified railroads, new public transit options, new forms of fuel replacement, and car-free cities. We would need to transform agriculture, a move from industrial agriculture to localized, regenerative, and resilient farming with limits on livestock production and a rapid phase out of factory farming. We would need to restore ecosystems, so a half-earth conservation and ocean protection program to halt the ongoing mass extinction of species and turn ecosystems into effective carbon sinks. This is all technologically and economically possible, and in a short space of time, solutions are there. The absolute key issue is how to create enough political pressure. It's up to us to create that political will, and there are tried and tested techniques for doing that. So we're talking about the need for civil disobedience that escalates into a rebellion, an uprising. The good news is it doesn't need that many people, which gives everyone in this room, or everyone watching this video, everyone who hears this talk, an immense opportunity to do something amazing. So on the slide you see a picture of several freedom riders here, and they were civil rights activists who rode interstate buses into the segregated southern United States in 1961 and subsequent years to challenge the non-enforcement of the United States Supreme Court decisions. And it started with 25 arrests and ended with over 1,000. It was very, very effective. Research shows that we only need between 1 and 3% of the population to do this. In Canada, that's 1.1 million people, and here in Ontario, we only need 240,000 people who are willing to rise up and participate in some form of civil disobedience in order to make these changes. Seems doable, right? Albert Einstein said, "The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who don't do anything about it." The conventional approach to talking about climate change is based on lying. People aren't told the truth about climate change because the belief is that telling the truth will create a feeling of powerlessness in people, paralyze them, and thus lead to a lack of action. When something frightening happens, bystanders try to find a way to turn away from the thing causing them fear. However, upstanders try to address the actual thing causing the fear. So this talk is aiming to find upstanders, You can choose to be an upstander, and our approach is based on the belief that some small group of upstanding people will not only be willing to act, they will be willing to do whatever it takes. For example, here we have Gandhi, who said, civil disobedience becomes a sacred duty when the state becomes lawless or corrupt. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says, we who engage in the nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring it to the surface, the hidden tension that is already alive. Climate change is not a political issue. It is an issue of morality. What is happening is bad, and it's evil, and has to be stopped. Ariel Deranger, Executive Director of Canada's only Indigenous-led climate justice organization, says, our people and our Mother Earth can no longer afford to be economic hostages in the race to industrialize our homelands. It's time for our people to rise up and take back our role as caretakers and stewards of the land. When a government does something that is horrendously immoral, it must be challenged, regardless of your political choice. Across political spectrum, the idea of rebellion is understood to be important under extreme circumstances. Political theorists agree that rebellion is justified once the establishment failed. And here we see the RCMP rating sovereign Wet'suwet'en Nation over a new fracked gas pipeline, and this just happened mid-January of this year. Now this gives way to what political philosophers call the right of revolution. When a government fails to protect the lives and livelihoods of their citizens, as in the case of climate change, the people have a right to rebel. And Judy Wilson has saying, we are doing this for everybody. We have to change to ensure that our young people have a future. That's what the Indigenous land defenders are talking about when they say we have to protect the land and the water. Now we get into what is an appropriate response. So conventional approach to tackling issues involving raising awareness, leafleting, lobbying, sending emails to your MP, right? Building a collective demand like a petition or going on a one-day march. So these approaches are appropriate for relatively small political issues like an unwanted housing development. And it's appropriate for the initial stages of a campaign to raise awareness. But we're long past this stage in the ecological crisis. But they are not appropriate for issues that are existential and are urgent, or when there are powerful political and economic interests involved that stop necessary change from happening. In this case, an appropriate response requires high-stake, disruptive civil disobedience and nonviolent sacrificial action. So nonviolent action involves the following aspects, and this is only a very short summary. But one, it has to be disruptive. So disruption of major cities will get the attention of political decision makers. And it also gets people talking even if they don't like the methods. Second, it must be sacrificial. This makes observers sympathetic to your cause and demonstrates to decision makers how serious you are about the cause. Number three, backfiring. The opponents tend to respond to the direct action with repression. This backfires as it shows them in a bad light to observers who are therefore more likely to join in. And number four, it must be respectful. The opponents are treated with respect. In addition to the moral importance of respectfulness, it also makes it more likely that opponents agree to negotiations and to the demands of those engaging in civil disobedience. Nonviolence is morally and materially functional. Nonviolent civil disobedience has strong grounding in history up to the present day and has been extensively studied. Its efficiency is well known. People tend to like it in the past, but less so in the present. Extinction Rebellion Global is planning on uprising against the world governments in April 2019, following the Canadian Declaration of Rebellion on February 14th, which is already done. We demand that the Canadian government tell the truth about the climate emergency, reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025, and work with the media to communicate actions people can do and the emergency we are in, and to reverse policies that aren't in accord with this. Furthermore, we aim to set up a National Assembly to represent the will of the people for the transition. The National Assembly will be based on a sortition system. Representatives would be chosen by random and only serve for short periods of time. In order to get the government to come to the bargaining table, so to speak, we are hosting talks like this all across Ontario and across Canada. The week of April 15th to the 28th is the International Week of Rebellion, and so we are trying to get folks together in order to take mass actions of civil disobedience for that time. And it's in coordination with 35 countries around the world. We need to support our local Extinction Rebellion groups. We need to organize, and we need to do this offline and face to face. So what we plan on doing is escalating the actions until our demands are met. This is not a one-time campaign. We basically repeat periods of action with organizing in between, and until we are sitting at the table and the government is willing to listen to our demands. And what we really need to do right now is to immediately shift the climate Overton window. The Overton window is a phrase referring to what is seen as normal and acceptable part of mainstream public discussion of issues. The debate in popular press about climate change tends to be limited to the fact that it will be a substantial cost. As we've now seen, this doesn't really reflect reality. Disruptive and unexpected behavior can change the Overton window. For example, Donald Trump has managed to move the Overton window to a place where upfront racism becomes normalized, whereas a few years ago, we couldn't have imagined an American president caging children and talking about banning Muslims. So we want the reality of the ecological threat to be a mainstream discussion, for people to know how bad a state we are leaving the world in for our children, and not for future generations, which can sound some time away and not so imminent and real. So the first step of the rebellion is to shift this Overton window. It will probably require something like 100 people to go to jail and or 1,000 arrests in a short space of time. Of course, then the intention is to mobilize more people. We envision a world where we build thriving connections within our society and environment, bringing hope and enabling us to decide the direction of our lives and futures. An inclusive world where we work consciously to ensure fair processes of collective decision-making, where creativity is prioritized, and where our diversity of gifts are recognized, celebrated, and flourish. At this point, if you would like to sign up to the Extinction Rebellion chapter in Ontario, you can do so by clicking a link below on this video. And if you're willing to deliver this talk in your community, there's also a form to fill out below, and you will receive a whole copy of this talk, the notes, and everything you need to host this talk in your area. We aim to support and encourage a citizens' uprising in Canada and in Ontario in particular, involving low-level and higher-risk acts of civil disobedience by some, with others willing to support those that take action. When ready, create a participatory democratic process that discusses and improves a draft manifesto for change and new constitution. This will involve creating a genuine democracy alongside an economy to maximize well-being and minimize harm. Our mission is to spark and sustain a spirit of creative rebellion, which will enable much-needed changes in our political, economic, and social landscape. We endeavor to mobilize and train organizers to skillfully open up space so that communities can develop the tools they need to address Canada's deeply rooted problems. We work to transform our society into one that is compassionate, inclusive, sustainable, equitable, and connected. And last but certainly not least is our principles and values. We have a shared vision of change, creating a world that is fit for generations to come. We set our mission on what is necessary, mobilizing 3% of the population to achieve system change, using ideas such as momentum-driven organizing to achieve this. We need a regenerative culture, creating a culture which is healthy, resilient, and adaptable. We openly challenge ourselves and this toxic system, leaving our comfort zones to take action for change. We value reflecting and learning, following a cycle of action, reflection, learning, and planning for more action. Learning from other movements and contexts as well as our own experiences. We welcome everyone and every part of everyone, working actively to create safer and more accessible spaces. We actively mitigate for power, breaking down hierarchies of power for more equitable participation. We avoid blaming and shaming. We live in a toxic system, but no individual is to blame. We are a nonviolent network, using nonviolent strategy and tactics as the most effective way to bring about change. We are based on autonomy and decentralization. We collectively create the structures we need to challenge power. Anyone who follows these core principles and values can take action in the name of Extinction Rebellion. Thank you all for getting to the end of this presentation here. I do know that this is not easy to hear, but I hope some of you are inspired to take action. And if you are, please follow the links listed below on how to join, how to deliver this talk in your area. And if you feel like donating, please do. All the links are there for you. And if you'd like to subscribe to our channel for more direction, you certainly may do so as well. We would be really happy to have you on board. If you have any questions, please feel free to give us a shout out on Facebook, or you can reach us at Extinction Rebellion Ontario at protonmail.com. Thank you.